The majority of us live in a mostly democratic, civilized world. Gabo, Diego, I'm so sorry. Maybe the electricity were the friends we made along the way. Where was I? Oh yeah. Mostly democratic, civilized world, far better than the old world of disease, predators, and better of all, not having a life expectancy of 20 years like in the Stone Age. Some say that the development of weapons, such as the nuclear ones, or international relationships, better arranged than those of World War I of course, have prevented large countries from fighting each other for the last 79 years, creating the most peaceful era in history. It's sad that we needed 2 world wars to shield the hell up. But how did we get to civilization? Where did the history of humankind start? Well, we weren't always humans in a way. We didn't look like this a long while ago. We were rather hominids, like a dozen million years ago. We know about 24 species or subspecies of hominids. How many of them are our ancestors? Well, only a few of them, we think. The first common ancestor of all hominids, the All-Father, lived about 14 million years ago, probably in East Africa. The first hominin, with an N instead of a D, who walked 7 million years ago, and who's believed to be our direct ancestor, is the Sahelanthropus chadensis, from the north of Chad. This is the OG Chad, and probably your greatest grandpa. Say hi. The reason for the walking was because around this time, the African plains changed their climate, turning into grasslands in which trees gave less food than before to our grandpas, so they had to stop slacking and get better. The first species to do basic minecrafting about 2.4 million years ago were the Homo habilis, and when I say basic, I really mean it. They were the pioneers of what we call Old Stone Age, the Paleolithic. The first species to leave Africa were the Homo erectus, about 1.8 million years ago, who got as far as China and Indonesia. They were the first ones to cook. Gordon Ramsay should do a video about their cooking. Okay, I'll stop. About 700,000 years ago, a few descendants from the Homo erectus, the East African ones, turned into the Homo heidelbergensis, who hunted in packs, crafted spears and basic tools. They partially migrated to Iberia, in the north of which they used a cave known as Cima de los Muertos. They seem to have been the first to use this cave as a burial site for their family members, which seems to me like the first demonstration of strong family bonds and feelings far beyond those of most animals. This is where something resembling humanity really showed up. They also migrated to Siberia and other parts of Europe, transcending into the Neanderthals 400,000 years ago, who were the most advanced so far, very similar to us. The first ones to do cave paintings, which were useful to teach their kids what to hunt, fight, and most importantly, what to run away from. They wore ornaments like necklaces and arguably crafted the first musical instrument, a tiny flute. But changes in climate wiped most of them out multiple times because they weren't smart enough to communicate and craft as a team to adapt to the changes and predators. We've even found a site in which they had to resort to cannibalism, even of those who were too young. You see, the reason we humans collaborate with each other is so we don't end up like them. During this time, a few of these subspecies started wearing clothes. Due to realizing we could just steal the fur from other animals, we never grew our own fur back, eternally grateful of not being furry. And then we showed up as early Homo sapiens 300,000 years ago. Were we descendants from those hominins of Asia, Iberia, or Europe? No, East Africa or Morocco. Direct descendants from some Homo heidelbergensis. In our humble beginnings, we were, with scientific accuracy, freaking stupid. We had to resort to constant moving due to being in small groups and not knowing how to replant the plant fuel sources we consumed. Most of us didn't leave Africa until 100,000 years ago, when the last ice age was starting. We reached Arabia about 70,000 years ago, India and all the way to Australia about 65, Europe about 47, and Las Americas about 25,000 years ago. In the meantime, we developed coats, leggings, baskets, and many more tools. Wherever we went, populations of plants and animals mysteriously disappeared. Totally unrelated, of course. Jokes aside, some refer to this as the destructive nature of mankind. Meanwhile, your grandpa was just trying to do the same thing all other predators needed to do to even survive. We were just smarter. We met other archaic human species, like the Neanderthals, the Homo denisovans, Homo erectus, and also a particular subspecies of the latter, which inhabited the Indonesian island of Flores, where a mutation, probably due to island isolation, made them significantly shorter in stature. The Homo floresiensis, also known as hobbits, who were about 3 feet 6 tall on average. That's 110 centimeters in normal. Unfortunately, the scarcity made them less smart than their chef ancestors, making them less likely to survive. Our last proof of them being alive was from 50,000 BCE, but the local Leo tribe say that they have seen a creature that they call ape man as recently as in the 2010s, whose characteristics coincide with the Floriensis. Bear in mind that these people couldn't lie, because they should have literally no idea that they lived thousands of years ago. So who knows, maybe the hobbits are still within us. After reaching nearly every corner of the world, we continued to be nomadic hunter-gatherers. And as we met our distant cousins, it is likely that the harsh conditions of the climate change and the ongoing ice age caused competition for food between us and them, who were less advanced. They started going extinct as we rised and tried to survive. But our crossover was a real thing for a while. In 50,000 BCE, while Neanderthals were making necklaces in some cave in Belgium, the Floriensis were hunting elephants in Indonesia, the Denisovans were chilling in some Australian beach, and we were having a freaking boss fight against a mammoth in the very north of Siberia. I don't know about you, but I wouldn't mind a Warhammer minus 50k. Some sapiens seem to have mated the others, because to this day, many in Europe have 1 to 4% of their DNA being Neanderthal, and populations in Indochina, Indonesia, and native Australians have up to 5% of their DNA being Homo denisovan. The last standing archaic human, a Neanderthal, in Gibraltar, seems to have left us about 24,000 years ago. But we refused to go extinct during the last ice age. We endured. But what about cultivating? Well, there is evidence of us making flour as back as 40,000 years ago in Russia, Czech Republic, and Italy. History hasn't even started, and the bloody Italians are already trying to make pasta. Jesus Christ. Some populations in the Middle East started being sedentary for the first time, focusing on fully fledged hunting strategies, probably even with basic bows and arrows. The first notable settlement in the history of humankind in general was Ohallo II in the Levant, south shore of the Sea of Galilee, from 21,000 BCE, at the start of the Epipaleolithic, or final Old Stone Age. This was the first place in which, across thousands of years of prevailing, cultivated and consumed crops in significant amounts, such as legumes, wheat, and barley. The evolution of farming was slow. It isn't simple to gather, plant, irrigate, collect, process, and then properly store grain when you have no idea it is necessary or even possible. The site is full of evidence of the first uses of things like sickles, grindstones, waste disposal sites, and the first evidence of men and women occupying different roles, the men doing more tool making and the women doing plant grinding and processing, although they both hunted as much. Needless to say, female musculature was on average about 90% of men's, being way more similar than it is in modern society, except for gym rats, of course. It's just that us men, we just like making tools and stuff. Leave us alone. But the last glacial maximum of the last ice age was from 19,000 to 13,500 BCE. The average temperatures were down to 20 degrees colder than now in some areas. So farming in the northern hemisphere was, as you can see, a little bit harder, but making the Levant cooler and full of forests helped the rise of multiple settlements across the following millennia, similar to All-Hallow II. This period saw the first evidence of semi-sedentary hunter-gatherer cultures, like the Magdalenians in Europe and the Jomon in northern Japan. As an honorary mention, around 13,000 BCE, the ancestors of humankind's best friend joined the ranks in the human saga. Some people went a step ahead of All-Hallow II in the southern Levant, the Natufian culture, from 13,000 BCE to 9500 BCE, with improved tools. They were the first to build stone foundations for stone houses, and apparently made bread and brewed beer. The possible ritual use of the latter seems to have created a high demand for its production. Was it enraging alcoholism that motivated them to be the first major farmers? I don't have proof, but I don't have any doubts either. Their culture spread to the other side of the Levant, in northern Syria, and prevailed for a long while, but the abrupt changes in climate due to the end of the last ice age, the so-called Younger Dryas, around 20,800 BCE, caused their settlements to be abandoned. And then came the geological epoch known as Holocene, in which we still are, and also the Neolithic, or New Stone Age, around 10,000 BCE, as the climate got very similar to the modern one. Picking up from former Natufian practices, more new cultures of the Levant learned to domesticate cattle, engaged in cultivation, and built more permanent settlements, many of these in the area now known as the Fertile Crescent. Communities like Yerfelamah were built, being sturdier and having a grain storage building. But this period saw the rise of the first two megastructures of mankind, both in southeastern Anatolia, Karahan Tepe from around 10,000 BCE and Göbekli Tepe from 9500 BCE, the latter of which may be the first temple in history. Buried underground for thousands of years, they both have large circular structures containing massive stone pillars, being the first stone megaliths that are capable of making you wonder, how did they get these things in here? Were they on trend? These pillars are T-shaped and are decorated with sculptures and paintings of animals, but they are surrounded by domestic structures, so a fair amount of people definitely lived in there. Some other sites in the nearby areas show a culture similar to them too, and even Yerfelamah seems to be related. So as far as we know, this was the first popular religion, one in which we adored T-shaped pillars and animal representations of, who knows? It was improved through generations until it was later abandoned. The reason? Well, we don't really know. Many refer to the inhabitants as simple nomadic hunter-gatherers, but it makes more sense for them to be more civilized and sedentary than that. There are some theories of how was it buried. Maybe Göbekli was intentionally filled to preserve it, or maybe just heavy rain and erosion displaced and buried all settlements in the area. Some even blame the floods related to the Younger Dryas for it. Unfortunately, only 5% of Göbekli Tepe has been excavated due to the decision of the owners. Advanced scans prove that only 40% of its megaliths have been digged out, implying that the population was really high and their advancements greater than we thought. So not only are they about 7,000 years older than Stonehenge, but also way larger. Karahan is expected to be the largest of the two, making professionals believe that they may be the birthplace of the first civilization. But we can only be sure when we discover more about them. We have proof of a large feast taking place in Göbekli Tepe after the making of the megaliths. This was our first purpose-driven project and communal masterpiece, our first celebration together, as far as we know. Nearby sites later adopted the appreciation of T-shaped pillars, but without the animal paintings, and the following millennia saw the foundation of the first proto-cities, and even the first Sumerian city, but that will be the next episode. Our past is filled up with mysteries. Every time we find things being actually older than we thought, we realize how much is yet to discover. Carbon dating is an amazing tool to guide us, which is the way that we can know how old things are, but we can't expect it to give us an exact year. The first temple and first big settlements in history that we know of, Göbekli Tepe and Karahan Tepe, were founded around 10,000 to 9500 BCE, and that was the start of the pre-pottery Neolithic A, since the period is divided in A, B and C. In general, it marks the start of the domestication of cattle and the widespread of cultivation in the Middle East, which is known as the Neolithic Revolution. Bear in mind that at this time, this area was more fertile than now, because the last ice age was technically still going on. In this period, two settlements stand out. The first one is Tel Caramel, that's an appetizing name, inhabited from 10,650 to 9,650 BCE in the north of Syria. This period coincides with the Younger Dryas, a period of climate change that suddenly made the northern hemisphere colder and less fertile, including the Levant, making it harder to have permanent settlements. This site had history's first stone towers, 5 of them. Some of the inhabitants had teeth with wear and caries, a sign of the consumption of carbohydrates from grains, and many had their heads intentionally removed, showing the earliest signs of a degree of adoration towards skulls, a head cult. 3 modified skulls were found in Göbekli Tepe as well, suggesting they also had that kind of cult. The other one is near the city of Jericho, northwest of the Sea of Galilee in the Levant, a site called Tel es Sultan. It was first occupied by the Natufian culture in the previous millennia, who were the first culture to make bread and brew beer. But after the Younger Dryas, it became a permanent settlement, which around 9000 BCE probably housed 2,000 to 3,000 people, giving it the honor of being the first town in history. They built circular stone houses that were about 5 meters wide, and that tower you can see in the center wasn't built until 1000 years later. Having been 8.5 meters tall, it inherited the title of the world's tallest building. It must have required hundreds of people to build it, suggesting the presence of social organization or even a hierarchy. Since the tower is in the very center of the town rather than outside, we don't really know what its purpose was. Maybe to protect salt or grain storages, or simply for the sake of showing off. A big tower like this might have been the greatest sign of status at the time. The start of the pre-pottery Neolithic B will be 8800 BCE, when we see the introduction of plastered skulls like the famous Jericho skull. The plastering seems like an attempt of immortalizing loved ones or important members of society by recreating their facial features with plaster, which was also a head cult. This will be done for the following millennia in many parts of the Middle East, from the southern Levant to Anatolia, suggesting a common culture and possibly a similar language. And our next protagonists are the people of Shayonu in eastern Anatolia. founded in 8630 BCE, is considered to be the first proto-city. They were the first ones to use measurements for parallel foundations, to do leatherworking, the first textile piece of cloth, to domesticate pigs, and later sheep and goats, and the mining of copper, being way ahead of their time. They adopted rectangular buildings instead of circular. The purpose of this was to be able to build houses right next to each other, sharing walls and making all houses sturdier. As an honorary mention, the site of Nevali Shori, inhabited from 8400 to 8100 BCE, is strikingly similar to Chayonu and contained a section with a few stone pillars with animal paintings, some of them being T-shaped. And this big one, although broken, still has the same human features that an almost identical one from Göbekli Tepe had, with hands and a sort of belt. The site probably relates to the other ones in this period, so the T-shape adoring culture might have endured for a good while. But all of these advancements so far, always closer to civilization, are impressive due to how old they are. In perspective, at this time 10,000 years ago, when it's considered that the last ice age finally ended and the sea levels were still rising from its glacial maximum 5,000 years prior, so landscapes like Doggerland were still higher than sea level, connecting France to Great Britain. France and Britain used to be part of the same land. I think that might be a fact that both countries will love to delete from their memory. Next up is what some call pre-pottery Neolithic C, from around 7800 BCE. We will start with Ein Ghazal, close to Jericho. Although it was populated since 8300 BCE, it was around 7000 BCE that it achieved a population of 3,000 people. 4 to 5 times the size of contemporary Jericho. It's actually more well known because of its statues, the first to be made with such detail and human size at the same time. It's 15 full-size ones and 15 busts, together with similar ones being done in Jericho at the time, which is a lot of art being performed very early. The societies of the time relied mostly on domesticated cattle and farming to survive, but they still benefited from a lot of hunting, which is implied by the dozens of statues of wild animals. These had the same purpose as animal paintings, but they are in 3D now, we're upgrading. And the greatest settlement of humanity until now is Çatalhöyük, from southern Anatolia, inhabited from 7500 BCE. This has been famously called humanity's first city. But why? Because during its peak around 7000 BCE, it housed up to 10,000 people. The average modern town houses about 5,000, and anything higher than that could be considered as a small city. Ein Ghazal is considered by many to also be one of the first cities. Their houses were built together like a honeycomb or a maze, with no roads, relying on roof openings and ladders to get in and out. The rooftops served as their streets. There were no distinguishable public buildings, not even ritualistic ones. Instead, a part of their houses seemed to be dedicated to religious acts. The houses were scrupulously clean. They painted the insides with white plaster, and the bigger houses had art murals. The most mysterious aspect of their art is how they had this representation of a bear being very similar to one from Göbekli Tepe, in the same exact pose. And these representations of headless humans alongside birds, probably vultures, are similar to the ones found in pillars from Göbekli. That, alongside them having a head cult, implies that both cultures, over 3,000 years apart, might be linked. That is the same gap between the Bronze Age collapse in 1200 BCE and us. Both Ain Ghazal and Çatalhöyük, alongside Çayonu and many other settlements, practice some form of head cult, removing skulls and plastering or adorning them. Unfortunately, they all lost most of their population around 6500 BCE, this being the end of the pre-pottery Neolithic. The climate-changing event that caused this was the 8.2 kiloyear event. The sudden melting of glacial sheets in North America raised the sea levels, quickly changing temperatures all around the globe, making it overall cooler and drier. Now we move to, obviously, the Pottery Neolithic, or Late Neolithic, starting in 6500 BCE, and we're going to travel to Mesopotamia, which means lands between rivers, and that's the reason why we're going there. The rivers, Euphrates and Tigris, since the Levant and Anatolia lost a fair amount of their fertility, the areas next to these rivers will continue to allow people to survive on a sedentary farmer lifestyle. So the few who were able to migrate might have integrated the now rising cultures in the area, but our beloved T-shaped adoring culture will never be seen seeking a sedentary lifestyle again. Rest in hunter-gathering, my friends. These cultures were the Hassuna and Samarra, who are responsible for the pottery in the name of this period. Now, there were basic forms of pottery being made as back as 29,000 BCE by the Gravitian culture in Czechia, the makers of this famous Venus figurine, and also being made by the Jomon in 10,500 BCE, who actually made pottery before becoming farmers, by the way. But these Mesopotamian populations were the first, adorning them with excellent skill, and the first major uses of it, for cooking, storing food, transportation, you name it. Some of their settlements were built in more arid areas of Mesopotamia, and another culture would join them around 6100 BCE, the Halaf culture, between southeastern Anatolia and Mesopotamia, who would repopulate some settlements that were abandoned by the former two cultures. They also did pottery and were the first to do stamp seals. All of them seem to have been the first to use draft animals in farming and the earliest forms of plows. The first agrarian societies to reach Europe made the earliest site we know of in Albania around 6500 BCE, which slowly spread to the west, starting to do a fair amount of pottery 1000 years later. And the first North African farmers were those of Egypt in 6100 BCE, like in Napta Playa. But the ancestors of the Mesopotamian civilizations were the Ubaid from 5500 BCE, founding various settlements in the area, including Uruk and Ur, which will be very important later on. These people built elevated foundations into the swamps next to the rivers and were able to cultivate in these areas. With time, they also spread to the Levant and the Zagros Mountains, introducing the use of a fair amount of flint, and in 5000 BCE, they were pioneers of the Copper Age, or Chalcolithic, making copper pins and chisels through metallurgy. They had some houses that were bigger than the others and had partial ritualistic purposes, which are today called temples, implying a hierarchy ruled by priests. The period after 4000 BCE would see a large development of urban areas, including the city that gives the following period its name, Uruk, the birthplace of the Sumerian civilization. But that will be on the next episode. Fun fact, the Emperor of Mankind from the universe of Warhammer 40k is known to have been born between 8000 and 6000 BCE, as mentioned in the book The Master of Mankind. Now, he was also called a Hittite, but this culture did not rise until 2000 BCE, and the populations that would become the Hittites didn't come to Anatolia until 4400, implying that this is either a mistake or it just means that he took control of the Hittite Empire later on, which had an eagle with two heads, funnily enough. He would have been instead born to a head called Neolithic culture, maybe even like those of Göbekli Tepe, like my avatar. I would also like to point out how humanity needed a cataclysmic event, like the Younger Dryas, to focus mainly on farming and having a sedentary lifestyle. And then we needed another one, like the 8.2 kiloyear event, to realize that we needed containers to store the food and make it last longer. 300,000 years of human existence, and it's only in the last 5% that we make significant changes. And that shows you how incredibly important incentive is for things being done properly. Who were the original Europeans? You could say the first humans were not us, the Homo sapiens, but the other species of the genus Homo, the so-called hominins, with an N. I'll also tell you about the original sapiens of Europe. The earliest evidence of hominin activity in Europe, and outside of Africa in general, comes from the site of Drumșanu in Romania, dated in January of 2025 to be about 2 million years old. It wasn't hominin bones that were found, but at least 20 of the animal bones that were examined show clear evidence of human-made cuts, the kind of cuts that other animals either can't or don't need to do before consuming meat. You can read more about it in the article in the description. So the earliest known humans in Europe were Romanian. I now feel patriotic about beautiful Romania. So much that I will now expropriate the avatar of Pandro and even the avatar of Gabo, cause who doesn't love the Varangian Guard? Also, if you're wondering which species of hominins they were, just know that we have no idea. We later have the Homo antecessor, which means pioneer man, from Atapuerca, Spain, which is 1.2 million years old. And what was found was an incomplete skull, which looks surprisingly flat, alike to modern humans, and different from that of archaic hominin species, since they didn't leave any descendants. The Homo antecessors are considered as an evolutionary spin-off rather than a step in human evolution, despite the fact that they looked quite modern. They will be replaced by the Homo heidelbergensis in Atapuerca, being descendants from the Homo erectus from 600,000 years ago, and it was from them that descended the Neanderthals from 400,000 years ago, being the first human species to leave behind a substantial amount of culture, advanced tools, and most of all, evidence of their existence over large areas of Europe and Asia, including the Middle East. These will be important later on, and us, the Homo sapiens, originated in the Horn of Africa 200 to 300,000 years ago. Although many debate how, or even if that was the case, there is plenty of evidence backing this up, and not enough to contest it yet. But there is a lot of information that we're missing, so we don't know what we'll find out later on. But moving on, these sapiens made migrations out of Africa about 100,000 years ago, first to the Levant and then to East Asia and Australia. But the earliest evidence of sapiens in Europe dates to 56,800 years ago in Grotte Mandrin, France. The earliest sapiens in Europe were French. That's it guys, uninstall Europe. The evidence were a few stone tools and a single tooth. Yes, one tooth. For real. And there is also evidence in Germany, in the cave of Ilsenhülle, I probably pronounced that wrong, which is right under the Ranis castle. I probably pronounced that wrong too. 45,000 years ago, with with bone fragments that have been confirmed to belong to the Homo sapiens. The early Homo sapiens used to be known as Cro-Magnon, but they are professionally called European Early Modern Humans, or EMH, which is fair because Cro-Magnon makes you think of a different species of Homo when they were just early Homo sapiens. Thing is that about 42,000 years ago, the Earth suffered something like the end of the world, called the Adams Event, which temporarily reversed the magnetic field of the planet, increasing solar radiation and causing mass extinctions, and is believed to be one of the main causes of the decline of the Neanderthal populations, allowing the sapiens to migrate into previously Neanderthal-dominated lands. 2,000 years later, the overwhelming majority of Neanderthals faded from archaeological records, being replaced by the sapiens. The way they went extinct is debated, but their existence is not completely gone. These first migrations of EMH interbred with European Neanderthals, but they didn't leave any genetic legacy unto present-day Europeans. But the ones that came after 37,000 years ago did contribute a little bit of ancestry to modern-day Europeans, although these ones had interbred with the Neanderthals in the Middle East. Contrary to the idea that we used to have that only Europeans had Neanderthal DNA, turns out that nearly all populations of the Earth have some degree of their DNA, with the highest concentration being Eastern and Northeastern Asian with 2%, and the lowest being Sub-Saharan African with 0.5%. Some people might have up to 4% Neanderthal DNA, which is wild, but the fact that such DNA has made it all the way to 2025 suggests that the populations of the time will have had a higher concentration of it, and now we are the last surviving species of the genus Homo. We're alone in this world. That is so sad. Guys, leave the chat, I want to be alone. The EMH, or Cro-Magnons, had thicker bones than us. Yes, people with actual big bones, and were relatively tall, with an average of 5'9" feet on men and 5'4" on women. They created tools that were very much more advanced than the Neanderthals, to the point that in their last centuries of existence, the latter copied their style. They did some beautiful cave paintings with realistic looking animals and hunting scenes, and even made ritualistic burials, which implies that they believed in life after death. Contrary to popular misconception, and this is going to be the polemical part of the video, these early Europeans had darker skin tones, partially because they came from the south, but not only that. Two of the main alleles responsible for light and white skin, which only has the purpose of making your skin more sensible to sunlight to make vitamin D. SLC24A5 and SLC45A2 did not exist until 28 to 22,000 years ago, didn't experience positive natural selection until 19 to 11,000 years ago, and didn't become the majority in Europe until 5,000 years ago, during the early Bronze Age. In comparison, at this time, Sumer had already been a civilization for 500 years, with a writing system and a monumental architecture as the White Temple. Egypt had been unified by Pharaoh Nahma 150 years prior and was also a civilization, and even the Harappan or Indus Valley were on their way to becoming one, which is incredible. The reasons for this shift in skin color were that, first of all, for the majority of their existence, Europeans didn't need it. Why would you need vitamin D from the sun when you're a hunter-gatherer that gets a big source of vitamin D from your nutrition? but the shift into agriculture or pastoralism made them lose the big source of vitamin D, making light skin more useful. Another reason is that the early Europeans, or Cro-Magnon, actually contribute to a very small portion of the European DNA. From the three main composers of modern European DNA, the third one were the Western hunter-gatherers, who actually arrived in Europe about 20,000 years ago, replacing most of the EMH, and had darker skin tones due to depending on hunting big game animals that had a big source of vitamin D. They also had the genes for blue eyes. Yes, the first people with blue eyes had dark skin. And the actual main composer of modern genetic DNA were the early European farmers, or early Neolithic farmers, who arrived in Europe about 8,000 years ago from Anatolia. Yeah, the same guys who probably built Göbekli Tepe went all the way to build Stonehenge in England for some reason, and last but not least, taught the Europeans how to farm. They were mostly of light brown skin, but carried the alleles for light skin, which would proliferate after they inhabited zones that had a lot less sunlight. Like I said, they compose most of the genetic pool of modern Europeans, with the highest concentration in Sardinians, Spanish, and Etruscans. I mean Tuscans, well, same thing. If you look at a handsome Sardinian man, like the YouTuber Metatron, you can have an idea of what they used to look like, and you can tell the genetic difference between him and the Northern Europeans when he stands right next to his girlfriend, who looks like she was teleported from Hyperborea. If you know what Hyperborea is, you're a man of culture. And I'm missing the second most important genetic group, which is the one attributed to the Yamnaya, colloquially known as Indo-Europeans, or even as Aryans. But they were not a race, by the way. They were a mix of races who spoke a hypothetical language called Indo-European. But anyway, the highest concentration of their DNA today is found in Norwegians, Lithuanians, and Estonians. The Yamnaya descended from the ancient North Eurasians, from the north of Russia, who were the first sapiens to have blonde hair. But Yamnaya itself is the name given to a tribe from the Pontic-Caspian steppe, who were already a mix of genes, like I said, from Caucasus, Anatolia, Eastern hunter-gatherer, and some other parts of West Asia. Most of their members had light brown to brown skin, and only a few of them were blonde. Around 3000 BC, they were responsible for starting the spread of all of these genes, plus blonde hair and the Indo-European languages across a very large area of Eurasia. They also acquired the genes for blue eyes from the Western hunter-gatherers and brought them, together with light skin, to most of Europe. And most important of all, lactose tolerance. They brought it to Europe, because life is a lot better when you can have ice cream. And all of these were the original Europeans. In today's day and age, the fact of ancient Europeans not being white is utilized in an either ignorant or manipulative way by some people trying to prove that the modern Europeans are not the original inhabitants of Europe. There is the famous Cheddar Man from over 10,000 years ago, which is the oldest nearly complete skeleton of northwest Europe. From Cheddar, England, the skeleton was in the past reconstructed into a typical North European man, but after we found out that the skin color of the original Europeans was different, and considering he was a Western hunter-gatherer, a new reconstruction was made in 2019. Guess what it looks like. Are you ready? Here it goes. Obviously, dark skin doesn't mean that dark, but these kind of wild takes get loads of clicks and plausibly donations. Some also say that the only indigenous people of Europe are other populations than the modern Europeans, such as the Inuits of Greenland. How old were you when you found out that Greenland was part of Europe instead of North America? Also the Nenets of Siberia. I had no freaking idea Siberia was part of Europe. And also the Saami of Scandinavia, who have really been there for over 2,000 years ago. That is true. They are also indigenous to Europe, when in reality the first and also indigenous people of Europe are the goddamn Europeans. Just because the skin color was darker in the past, it does not mean that they aren't the only direct descendants from those populations, besides the fact that the migrations that came a bit later but are still like 8,000 years old had the alleles for white skin that modern Europeans have. So it's not a matter of black and white, literally. As a matter of fact, if you link the Cheddar Man with someone who descends from him, you get this white as a marshmallow guy. So yeah, they are the same people in a different environment. From the south of Chile through Europe and all the way to India, some interesting similarities show up in words, culture, ethnicity, and last but not least, lactose tolerance. This is because long ago, blonde hair, blue eyes, the word for father, mother, and so on, originated in the most unexpected places, being brought to the rest of the world by a remarkable, daring, and I must say, overly violent tribe that is 5,000 years old. But how did all of this happen? Long ago, around 45,000 BC, during the last ice age, the first humans to inhabit Europe and West Asia were dark-skinned, who reached all the way to Britain and Scandinavia through the millennia, some even living in the now sunk Doggerland during the Paleolithic or Old Stone Age. Their tools were made of wood and stone, hence the name of the period. The Neolithic or New Stone Age, which implies a common use of farming and cattle domestication, started in 10,000 BC in the Middle East, after 5200 BC being the start of the Chalcolithic, which means copper and Stone Age, since these people made tools with both materials throughout the entire era. They were Semitic populations who looked like, I don't know, historically accurate Jesus? Needless to say, all of these ethnicities look different than those of today, but at least you've got an idea. This period will take a while to start in Europe and the rest of Asia, but that doesn't mean that there were no impressive innovations. Around 6500 BC, archaic Anatolian populations, sometimes called Anatolian Caucasians, would reach Greece, Albania, and Serbia in the Balkans, bringing the Neolithic farming with them. If you're wondering what these people look like, they were similar to Armenians, like the members of System of a Down. They would reach Western Europe and even Britain around 4000 BC, building megaliths in Wales, England, together with megalithic tombs. The Amnia complex is the oldest fortress in the entire world, with its first defenses built around 6000 BC, having sophisticated structures and artifacts of wood and stone, probably made and inhabited by Proto-Uralic people, ancestors of Huns, Finnish, Hungarians, North Asian, and even the Proto-Indo-European language. The famous hunter of Soviet soldiers of World War II, Simo Halha, is an example of this ethnic group. Some of them had inherited blonde hair and maybe even the gene for red hair, which originated during the Ice Age in North Siberia and Central Asia respectively, therefore being over 10,000 years old. The fortress might have inspired some others all around Siberia and America, with Siberian people moving there. In 5980 BC, wine was made for the first time in Tbilisi, the capital of Georgia, Fun fact, Joseph Stalin was actually from Georgia, and in 5500 BC, the earliest proof of cheese making in Kujawia, Poland. By 5300, a few cultures from Germania, Netherlands, and the Baltics shared the use of similar pottery, engaging in a ceramic Mesolithic before practicing cultivation. The descendants of some Proto-Uralic people will migrate to central Russia, encountering the eastern hunter-gatherers. The latter achieved a higher percentage of blonde hair because of it being exotic, therefore appealing for reproduction. A part of them in West Ukraine in 6000 BC seem to have been the first humans with blue eyes, some of them with darker skin while still having them. Their descendants will reach the Pontic Caspian steppe around 4500 BC. They will mix with the hunter-gatherers of the Caucasus and Iran from West Asia and archaic Anatolians, generating a very famous population, the Proto-Indo-Europeans, or PIE. Therefore, their language would have been a mix of the former four cultures. They had medium to relatively light skin, although darker than modern Europeans, and mostly brown hair and eyes, with some having blonde hair and plausibly a few with red hair. So they looked a lot more like Chayanne than like Ryan Gosling. If you don't know who Chayanne is, that means you weren't born in Latin America, something that you should be grateful of. To all Latinos, yes guys, Chayanne is officially our old father. What the heck was I talking about? Oh yeah, this proves the early 1900s theory of them being an independent race, if you know who I'm talking about. But they were as mixed as any modern society. It took them a few hundred years to spread from northwest Kazakhstan to the north of Bulgaria, this area also being the origin of the PIE's best friend, the horse. The cultures that spoke this language were many, like the Samara, Valinsk, and Redny Stog. I probably didn't pronounce any of them right, sorry about that. Although independent from each other, after 4000 BC, they all shared the practice of agriculture, pastoralism, metallurgy, basic wagons, a kinship system, and the organized worshipping of a sky god, Deus Pater, possibly the original iteration of a Zeus. The small number 2 in the name means that it's an unknown letter. Imagine it's an A or something. Funnily enough, the words for Father God in Spanish, Dios Padre, are very similar to that ancient name. And they probably really liked eagles, cause many of their successive kingdoms and empires will have a freaking eagle on their flag or emblems, even the United States for just sake. Apparently, by these ancestral people, it was seen as an ideal of unlimited freedom. They were also probably the first to invent the wheel, since their word, to name it, is older than 3500 BC, the time in which the Sumerians adopted it. A part of them traveled to Anatolia between 5000 and 3000, becoming the ancestors of the Hittite kingdom, who invented the earliest written Indo-European language around 1650 BC. A notorious Indo-European culture was the Cucuteni Tripelia in Romania, Moldova, and Ukraine, who were up to 75% archaic Anatolian people. Between 4100 and 3500 BC, they inhabited mega sites of about 3,000 homes, housing from 20,000 to 46,000 people, being the largest cities since Çatalhöyük, and only beaten by the Uruk of 3100 BC, reaching about 1 million members in total, having the honor of being the first European proto-civilization. They are known for being amongst the first to practice developed dental hygiene, and had a characteristic painted pottery and houses, including ancient iterations of the yin-yang, and a certain symbol that I would rather not show on YouTube. Contrary to popular belief, they weren't hippies. They had weapons and fortified settlements, and a certain degree of hierarchy, although not too high, but they were still more peaceful than their eastern neighbors. After 3300 BC, an Indo-European tribe will spread their power across all of the Pontic Caspian steppe. The Yamnaya, also called kurgans due to their characteristic tumuli constructed over common peat graves, but some of them were buried with goods and even metal artifacts and weapons, suggesting a lack of egalitarianism. Many of these important people were women, probably leaders or priests. They were taller than their neighbors, about 5 feet and 9 inches, which is 175.5 in normal, although they were semi-nomadic, practicing agriculture occasionally. They also had a well-developed metallurgy, wore silver and gold jewelry, a basic hierarchy, and hunted with bows and arrows. They loved milk and yogurt and cheese, granting them a genetic resistance to lactose, and might have been the first to practice horse riding, an underrated super weapon for war. They traded with the Tripelians, but as the climate got colder and drier in 3200 BC, the inability to farm struck all of the Eastern European lands, struggling to feed their families. So there wasn't enough space and resources for both cultures to coexist. The Yamnaya resolved to violence, raiding and scavenging the Tripelian villages. Around 3000 BC, the Yamnaya were in control of a large portion of land, an uncivilized empire of man. And in 2750, the last Tripelian village was abandoned due to raiding and famine, as the survivors integrated the Yamnaya. Without writing or organized religion to pass rules and knowledge through generations, the culture started to split in 2800 BC and transcended into new ones, like the corded were in the north, having 75% Indo-European genetics, besides their language and beliefs, being responsible for bringing blonde hair and blue eyes to Scandinavia and Germania, as well as the antecedents of Odin, Thor, and the Germanic deities, being actually even more varied in ethnicities than their ancestors. As a matter of fact, it's likely due to the merging of Indo-Europeans with others that amber, hazel, and grey eyes originated. The following Scandinavian people were the battle axe culture, which, well, I don't need to explain them, do I? In 2800 BC, around the Rhine River in West Europe, the Bell-Beaker culture were known for their specific ceramic style and an early use of crosses in pottery, buttons, and discs. They were proficient in the use of archery and daggers of copper and bronze, bringing the Bronze Revolution wherever they went, alongside Indo-European features. They were also violent as heck, being responsible for wiping out entire populations in Europe. The making of the Stonehenge started in 3000 BC by the hands of Anatolians, but guess what happened when the Bell-Beakers showed up around 2450? Well, they finished the construction of Stonehenge by building the horseshoe in the center. They also may or may not have almost wiped out the original genetic pool of the British Isles. But hey, they're genetically resembling of modern British people, my actual neighbors. So let's give them the benefit of the doubt. They had a higher percentage of blonde hair and blue eyes than their ancestors, 50% original Neolithic farmers, and partially descending from the corded ware culture. They built a Stonehenge, but out of wood, in Germany, a wood henge. Actually, they made an official wood henge in Ireland, and built an otter henge that got buried for thousands of years by the sea, a sea henge. Wait, that's actually the official name. And they founded the first copper mine in northwestern Europe in Ross Island, North Ireland. As a consequence of all of this, you can see how predominant the Yamnaya genes are in Europe to this day, and of course, in all European colonies. The Indo-Europeans also reached Kazakhstan, founding the Sintashta culture around 2200, the first confirmed to use mounted warfare and the chariot, which gave it a great advantage. After 1500 BC, they would reach India, creating the wise Vedic culture, pioneers of the Sanskrit language. and also to Iran after 1000 BC, bringing their PIE language and genes to the ancestors of the almighty Achaemenid domain, the first Persian Empire. This is why Middle Eastern people with dark skin and light-colored eyes are quite common. The contact between PIE and Asian populations seems to have been the origin of green eyes somewhere between the Caucasus and Siberia around 2000 BC, which will reach Hallstatt and Saxon lands in the following millennia, where it's very common to this day. And that's it. Now you know that all humans have an inherent passion for rocks and cool sticks, that in any ancient Anatolic descendant there is a bit of a chill farmer, that in any British person there is a bit of an angry stabbing Dutchman, and in any European descendant, like me, there is an aggressive town raider. Now like the video and subscribe, or I'll invade your freaking village.